Zoom is just how I record the lectures. I think I did it again. I leave this plugged in and then pick up my mic. So I think we're good to go. So we're beginning at the beginning. You'll be covering some of this material in the yacht book, but let's start at 1492. What happened in 1492? Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? 1492. Why did he keep coming? We know why, the original is trying to find his way to a quicker way to the east, to China, to India. That's where Europeans had traditionally been going. That's where the center of the world, up until the 1400s, the center of the world was Asia. So that's where Europeans were constantly looking to get at, and the Europeans are still trying to find a quicker way there, except Columbus, he keeps bumping into this landmass, America. But the Europeans keep coming. Why do they keep coming? We know why they came initially, but why do they keep coming? Historians have developed a nice little catchphrase for you: God, gold, and glory. God, gold, and glory. Oh. I don't know how this appears in my slides from time to time. I don't know how this is, but maybe it's good that he's here. Maybe we can just settle. Maybe if I put my glasses on, it would help. I'm looking less and less like Dwight as the years go on. But my first teaching job, students called me Dr. Dwight. The funny thing is, I am from his part of the country. I know Scranton well. I never sold paper. There you go. Of course, one of my colleagues who called me Dwight, he looked like Andy. So then the great debate, would you rather look like Dwight or like Andy? I would say it depends on the season, right? I probably don't want to be Dwight in the first couple seasons. But by the end of the show, like, Andy's pretty awful. And Dwight, he's pretty cool. So do with what you will. He pops up from time to time. I apologize for his intervention. God, gold, and glory. Glory, the ability of a people to send out explorers to gather, even if it's just to kind of gather knowledge. But if you can establish a colony in a faraway land, this brings glory to you. This is the kind of thing that gets your name in the history books, right? And the evidence is, of course, the countries that set out explorers and established colonies during these years, they're in the history books. They're in the history book you're reading this weekend for Monday night, right? So glory, how do we as the Spanish, how do we as the French, how do we as the English, how do we make a lasting name for ourselves? We go and explore and we settle in distant lands. We establish empires over vast distances. And so glory is a motivation for coming to the New World. Gold. Columbus and the explorers, particularly in Central America, a little bit in South America, find a lot of gold. Gold carries a lot of weight, literally, a lot of weight in Europe during this time. Spain never should have become the great power that it did, but it did because it had this massive influx of New World gold during these years. The funny thing is, when the French and the English started settling in North America, they thought, based on what they had learned from Central and South America, they thought when they started settling in like Virginia and Massachusetts that they'd get off the boat and there'd be like gold lists laying everywhere, like an Easter egg hunt, and they just go and like pick it up, put it in their pockets and go. And what the English and the French would have to discover is that gold comes in different forms in North America. But I'm getting ahead of things. And then finally, God. The Europeans discovered there's people here. There's people here who not only that time seemed to forget, that they were a little bit behind on the evolutionary scale, but God seemed to have forgotten them. And so God, missionary endeavors became a major reason or major excuse, sometimes a major reason. You're a religious figure yourself to be watching a film about a very devout religious man, the black robe, and that's starting next week. If you were religious, then yeah, your motives are pretty pure, but even if they weren't, your justification still could be why are we going to settle in the new world? What is our reason for doing so? God. God wants us to do this. God wants us to settle in this new world. God wants us to bring the gospel to these helpless people. This is the symbol of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You might not have heard of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. You've probably heard of the Puritans before. Yeah, Coach talked to you about the Puritans. You know who Coach is? How many of your high school history teacher was also an athletic coach? Yeah, it's usually about 50%, right? Now, I don't want to bash Coach. A lot of coaches take their day jobs seriously. They're good teachers. Mine was not. Basketball coach is my history teacher in high school. He was terrible. He did like nothing for us, which is fine with me. I wanted to sleep, and so he let me sleep through his classes. I drooled all over my history textbook, but I got like 99s out of 100 on the tests because they were like multiple choice, and it was easy stuff. So he let me sleep through his class. It's amazing. I ever became a history teacher in my high school history. It was terrible. Hopefully you got the good coach. I had the bad coach, but I'm going to pick on Coach. So Coach probably taught you about the Puritans. This was their symbol, right? Not only does this tell us something about why the Puritans were doing what they're doing, but it also tells us something else. It tells us what they thought of the people that they were coming to. So look at this symbol. Tell me, what is this Massachusetts Bay Company symbol? What is this telling us about European attitudes, particularly English attitudes towards Native Americans? What do you see there?
Well, they're very simplified, and especially I would say with their outfits, it's just not a bush or
simplistic, maybe even scarcity. Yeah. Right? There's not a lot going on here. There's a couple of trees. He doesn't have a lot of clothes on. It seems like a pretty simple existence. Granted, this is Massachusetts. You think a lot of Native Americans dressing like this in Massachusetts? Yeah, not even in July, right? Is it exactly fig weather? But what is that lack of clothing? What is that trying to suggest about these Native Americans? Again, from a European perspective, yeah.
That they're inferior.
That they are inferior, particularly they don't know basic things like how to clothe themselves. Right? So very primitive. The fig leaf suggests a kind of primitiveness. Who else might a continent of people who kind of grew up with Bible stories and stuff? Why might they paint somebody of primitive? Yeah, did I hear Adam and Eve? Yeah, Adam and Eve. Right? There's a kind of this is the first time I kind of picked up on this, but yeah, good. This is kind of like an Adam-like figure that Europeans felt in some ways when they crossed the Atlantic. They weren't simply just going to a different continent. They were in some ways engaging in time travel. And so this is kind of an Adam figure here with his fig leaves. It didn't really seem to have anything to do with an accurate representation of the people themselves. What else do we notice about our friend here?
Yeah.
Here's a bow and arrow, and the bow and arrow it's not threatening, is it? It's, what kind of a posture would you describe this? Weak, defenseless, kind of welcoming. We're probably missing, the English, in case you're not getting the picture, the English love their print, right? We're missing the most obvious thing, right? The words coming out of his mouth. In case you can't get it from the picture itself, we're just going to spell it out for you. He's saying, come over and help us. It's not, come over and help us. Come over and help us. And what do they need help with? It seems like they need help with just about everything. He doesn't have much there. There's a couple trees, some fig leaves, not much going on. And these are not atypical, right? The English are pretty late to the colonizing endeavor in North America. The Spanish were there first, more out in the Southwest. The French are certainly there. We're going to be talking most about the French today. The English are coming in here fairly late to the colonization game, 1629, with their come over and help us. So we can kind of, as somebody summed it up, Europeans thought of Native Americans as culturally, physically, socially inferior. Not just that they were different, but again, that they were somehow left behind on the evolutionary scale, right? Civilization hadn't happened here. The primary word, or one of the primary descriptors that Europeans would use of Native Americans, savage, suggested that we're not quite sure that we're dealing with human beings. We're not quite sure they're something, they're a kind of creature that we think would become a human being at some point, but they're going to need some help, right? Come over and help us. Lift us from our savageness, help us become civilized like the English, like the European Christians were. So we have all kinds of artifacts from this time, letting us know what Europeans thought of Native Americans. Can we turn the tables? Can we talk about what Native Americans thought about the Europeans they were encountering? Is there a way to do this? You say, Edwards, we know there's not, right? It's not like Mr. Native American was sitting there, well, these palefaces, typing on their phone, these palefaces showed up today. I was really kind of surprised to see them. And right, they're not texting and blogging. They're not doing podcasts about the Europeans who are popping up here after 1492. They're not writing this stuff down. They're oral culture. So absent these kinds of basic sources of information from the past, what are we to make of, how could we possibly access Native American thoughts about the Europeans? Seems impossible, right? I want to suggest it's actually pretty easy. You might know that America today, one of the hot button issues is immigration. Whether we're talking about legal immigration or illegal immigration, it tends to bring up a lot of questions and frankly, a lot of anxiety, right? Americans wonder about, is immigration going to hurt us? Is immigration going to change us in some kind of way? Can we, we've been called this melting pot in the past. Can we survive with such diversity here? We've been a diverse population. Can we handle all this new diversity coming in here, right? We're debating, to kind of go back to like, what is America? That basic question that we'll have to keep coming back to in this class. Americans are very much in a redefinition kind of time, particularly when we have statistics like 2050, 2060, Hispanics are going to be the largest population within the United States. That's going to shift at some point in the course of your lifetime. And a lot of Americans are wondering, like, are we losing some kind of America? Can America hold together? So we have this kind of identity conflict or identity crisis even going on today. What was 1492? It was the first wave of illegal immigration into North America. It was people who were coming into North America, into a land that wasn't theirs, to meet a people that they didn't know, and somehow feel like they had a right to not just exploit the resources of this new land, but to actually stay here. And guess what? Exactly the same kind of debates that Americans are having today about immigrants. Native Americans were having exactly this kinds of debates among themselves. They have the ability to know that Native Americans were having all these kinds of asking all these kinds of questions of themselves. When these people started appearing after 1492, or the story started getting out about them, Native Americans entered into a kind of identity conflict and identity crisis themselves. Tribes that encountered these people had to debate, what are we going to do? Are these people a threat? Should we maybe welcome them? Should we be, maybe not come over and help us, but welcome? Should we be, you should go back home. Native Americans debated those kinds of questions. What to do with these people coming in. Just like Europeans weren't sure the people in North America or South America that they were encountering were human, guess what? Native Americans weren't sure that the Europeans were human. From the European perspective, Native Americans didn't look, act, talk the way a person should. Guess what? From the Native American perspective, Europeans did not look like, did not talk like, did not act like the way that a person should. Here's the problem when we, and here it is, here's the problem when we look at history from only one direction. We tell our history from the standpoint facing west. What did Europeans think about the New World? We need to face east. What did the New World think about Europe? Just like savage was a common word for Europeans to describe Native Americans, or Native Americans, paleface was a common descriptor because these individuals getting off these ships, these big logs, well, they were pretty pale. They didn't look like what a person's supposed to look like. And then they tried to talk. From Native American perspective, they didn't know, you guys, it wasn't that, oh, you guys have a different language? Oh, it's interesting. No, it was, you guys don't know how to talk right. You must be really stupid because you don't know how to talk. And then they watched the Europeans try to do like basic things like move, like walk, like figure out directions. And guess what? Europeans couldn't do it. And Native Americans are like, how could you not figure out your way around? How do you not know how to look at the trees, for instance? How can you not navigate? Now, a modern conception with Native Americans, oh, you guys are just different. Your culture is different. No, Native Americans thought exactly like Europeans. Native Americans said, you guys don't know how to navigate your way around? You must not be men. Native American tribes debated among themselves. Maybe these pale faces that are showing up here, maybe they aren't men. Maybe they're demons. Maybe they're here to hurt us. And so Native American tribes in times and places debated among themselves what to do with these Europeans. Here we have to deal with this whole European military superiority kind of thing. Military technology is relative to the kind of combat and the kind of training you're involved in. Yeah, in certain situations, I will take a 17th century musket over a bow and arrow, but there's a number of situations where it's not an advantage. It's a little bit easier to reload a bow and arrow than it is to reload a 17th century musket. In fact, it takes a fair amount of time to reload a 17th century musket. Even if you're really, really good, it's going to take you somewhere between, I mean, you got really, really good. You could maybe do it 40, 50 seconds or so. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds. Still, how long does it take to reload a bow and arrow? A little bit quicker than 30 seconds, huh? And once Native Americans figured out, it just makes a really loud noise. And as long as you're not like standing kind of right in front of it when it makes that loud noise, you're probably going to be okay. So just don't be standing in front of the thing when it makes the loud noise. Then pull out your bow and arrow and,
Fred's trying to reload his musket. He's got 5 arrows sticking out of it. Because when your weapon of choice is a bow and arrow, you get really good at using it over long distances. You get really good at being able to reload those bow and arrows really quick. So, yeah, in certain situations, you would want an 18th century, 17th century musket over a bow and arrow. But it's just not an advantage at this time. Native Americans, not only do they have the military advantage, they have the home field advantage. Native Americans are not going to European lands. Europeans are coming to Native Americans. So there's home field advantage. And so Native Americans, we have to imagine in times and places that Native Americans controlled their relationship with the Europeans. The story that we often tell ourselves is Europeans, you know, they went to the New World, and because we don't present any kind of perspective on Native Americans, what they might have been thinking or feeling or experiencing, we just think that Europeans just went over and just could kind of do whatever they wanted to in the New World. Sometimes we celebrate this. Columbus Day is a day to celebrate the spirit of enterprise, the European Christian culture. Probably what you got was a more balanced perspective in high school, something along the lines of how awful the Europeans were for coming in and just running roughshod over Native Americans. In both of those stories, though, Native Americans stand as come over and help us, helpless victims who could not in any way, shape, or form resist European colonization. And I have to tell you that that's just wrong. It's just bad history. So we need to recover, we need to tell stories of colonial North American history that present Native Americans as central actors in this story, along with Europeans. We have to face both directions at the same time. We can't just face west, we have to face east. Now, we know that in some cases, Europeans debating what to do with these pale faces, these strangers coming. We know that in some cases in American society, you know what? They probably are demons, let's just take them out. And that's what they did. Entire settlements of Europeans in the 1500s, 1600s, just wiped out. Because Native Americans ultimately decided we're not going to work. For the most part, Native Americans in North America decided to work with these palefaces. Decided to maybe not welcome them, at least try to have a relationship.
And we'll have some of those kinds of stories. You might ask, why would they do that? Well, it's easy to say that in retrospect. We know what old world diseases would do to Native American populations. We know what kind of pressures New World settlements would put upon Native American, inter-Native American relations. So it's easy in retrospect to look back and say, why would Native Americans welcome these Europeans? Didn't they experience them as a threat? Didn't they experience them as an enemy? Of course, the answer is no. Europeans were not perceived as a primary threat by Native Americans. Who was? Who did Native Americans just kind of live in peace and harmony over here? Did Native Americans have threats all around them? It's not a trick question. They had threats and enemies all around them. Who were the enemies? Other tribes, right? Europe comes into a continent that is characterized by really constant conflict between tribes, not just tribes, but between nations. We'll talk about nations. Native Americans, or this idea we have of like Native Americans, like this is kind of, Native Americans don't exist. There is no Native American. Right? What there are the individual tribes and individual nations. And just like we invest those kind of separate meanings with so much importance, sometimes we go to war, right? Imagine a time in which Michigan and Ohio went to war over Toledo.
well, we're all Americans. No, like at one point, it really mattered that you were a Michigander or an Ohioan, so much that we went to war over a piece of land, Toledo. The Native Americans, there was no Native American. There were the individual tribes and individual nations, and they fought constantly with each other. So when Europeans started showing up, Native Americans thought, maybe we can use these guys against our enemies. There's a lot, I mean, there's honestly a lot of different reasons. You'll get some of this in the textbooks. I'm not going to go into too much depth. There's a lot of reasons why Native Americans chose ultimately to try to work with Europeans rather than just wipe them out. It was Native Americans' choice to work with Europeans that ultimately led to what this is not a term for the time. It's what a great historian of this era ultimately kind of dubbed this time the middle ground. Right? We have to recognize the colonial period was not one of a kind of constant conflict or a kind of genocide narrative of Europeans running roughshod over Native Americans. We have to understand that the period between 1600 and 1800 in times and places was characterized by a middle ground where Europeans and Native Americans encountered each other on an equal footing. One could not control the other. They had to figure out how to get along. Well, it doesn't mean that there was not contest between them, but that contest was often not of a military nature, it was a cultural nature. Specifically, the middle ground that this is referring to, or the area that we'll be looking at, is what we might call, New England up into Massachusetts, but Pennsylvania, New York, we would call the mid-Atlantic states, and kind of the Great Lakes region, even stretching down somewhat into Ohio. This part of the country between 1600 and 1800 saw again and again and again experiences of a middle ground where Europeans and Native Americans faced each other as rivals, sure, but sometimes as colleagues, sometimes as co-workers, sometimes as people seeking mutual benefits from each other. So let's start trying to nail this down a little bit. This cultural war, culture contest that would take place in the middle ground between 1600 and 1800. We need to flesh this out a little bit. We'll talk about the English next Tuesday. We're going to focus on the French side of things today. The French began settling in North America. They're trying to do the same thing. French were trying to find a quicker way to Asia. They kept bumping into North America. They decided North America's got some things we want. French start settling around 1530s. By the 1630s, there's about 3,000 Frenchmen in present day Canada, kind of Quebec area. But there's kind of French, the Frenchmen kind of spread off throughout kind of the North Atlantic coast. And so this kind of Great Lakes region, there's all kinds of French in there, even though their bases were further north in present day. The French have a little bit different motivation for settling. First, fish and faith. Fish, there's pretty good fishing. Used to be pretty good fishing. Up the Atlantic coast of North America, probably still is. So the French come to fish. Particularly Frenchmen who didn't have many prospects in France. They came over here to fish because maybe they could get rich quick, go back to France, become a person of importance. Furs, little critters running around here. See a lot of beavers running around here in North America. And so the Europeans, with the help of Native Americans, pioneered the beaver, a fur trade in beaver pelts. The best visual image you get. What's the movie where Leonardo DiCaprio gets messed up by a bear? What's that? Brendan, yeah. I wouldn't necessarily recommend watching the whole thing, particularly the scene where he gets torn up by a bear. It's pretty awful. But watch like maybe the first 10 minutes or so. You'll get a really good visualization of the fur trade and kind of who's engaged in that and what's going on there. So the French are doing that. Understand, and obviously we'll talk more about how the English settlement is different. Understand more the kind of temporary nature of what the French are doing here. It's French men coming over looking to make a killing, pun intended, in the beaver trade, in the fur trade, do some fishing, but not necessarily stay around. Right? They're not necessarily looking to like find Mrs. White and build a home in present day New York. Right? They kind of want to make their money and then get out of here. The exception, the faith part, are the black robes. Anyone want to guess why they're called black robes? They wore black robes, yeah. The black robes were officially a Roman Catholic sect known as the Jesuits. Jesuit literally means Society of Jesus. The Jesuits were coming out of the Counter-Reformation around 1580s or so. They were founded by a Christian ex-military guy. The Jesuits were the hardcore missionaries of this age. The Jesuits went places, they worked with people, they were willing to risk stuff that nobody else would. The Jesuits were hardcore missionaries. And so the Jesuits got wind, hey, there's all these savages running around North America. The Jesuits were like, all right, time to bring the Christian faith to the savages. The Jesuits start heading over. Historians love the Jesuits because the Jesuits like encounter Native Americans. A lot of times the Jesuits learn Native American languages, and then they write down their accounts. So some of the best accounts we have of North America between 1600 and 1800 is because of the Jesuits writing up all this stuff, giving us a nice thick description of North America and Native American life. So historians like the Jesuits. The fact that they were willing to learn the languages of Native Americans suggested maybe the Jesuits weren't quite as ethnocentric. Maybe they weren't, quite as bound by a sense of cultural superiority, that they were willing to try to meet Native Americans more on a kind of middle ground. It is true, the Jesuits would certainly be more accommodating than the Puritans that we'll talk about on Tuesday. Nevertheless, the Jesuits engaged in their fair share of cultural superiority. Here's one Jesuit priest talking about Native Americans. It's from 1616. None could ever succeed in converting them, meaning Native Americans. None could ever succeed in converting them unless they made them men before they made them Christians. This priest is saying, we need to turn Native Americans into men, and then we can give them the gospel. Strike anyone as weird? And you guys taking like a theology or missions class or something? Any of your teachers say, all right, see, what we got to do is we got to go to this part of the world and we got to turn them into men, and then we'll share the gospel with them. No, I don't think so, right? You're probably going to learn this. Look, you're going into a part of the world culturally very different. The burden is upon you to try to understand and make connections with that culture, right? The burden is on you. It seems like for this priest, the burden was on Native Americans. Again, as we kind of talked a little bit about earlier, Europeans weren't even sure. They certainly didn't think Native Americans were Christian, but they weren't even sure that they were human beings. And so this particular priest is saying, we need to make them men, whatever that meant, and then we can give them the gospel. It's a very different way of thinking about missions work than you will encounter in your typical SAU experience. Another Jesuit priest, until Christians are the absolute masters of the Indians, missionaries will have scant success within a very special grace of God. Again, can you imagine any of your Bible teachers saying, go out and absolutely dominate, take control over that group of people, and then give them like the 4 spiritual gifts? It doesn't work that way, right?
Doesn't work that way anymore. We are very aware that the people have different cultures. The cultures are not necessarily good or bad, they're just different. And the burden on Christians is to try to find a way to communicate the gospel across cultural lines. That's not going on here, right? These priests, they might be learning the languages, but they're still thinking we have to somehow civilize these individuals. And only then can we share the gospel. One priest actually came up with a kind of mission strategy. He says, this is 1643. If I could see here a number of towns and villages, French towns and villages, if I could see here a number of towns and villages gathering enough of the fruits of the earth for their needs, our wandering Indians would soon range themselves under their protection, and being rendered sedentary by our example, especially if they were to be given some help, could easily be instructed in the faith. What's this guy's strategy? Say, look, what we need the French to come over in like huge numbers. We need the French men sure to come, but we need French families to come. We need the French in Quebec, yes, but we need the French to establish French towns and villages all up and down the Atlantic seaboard. If we do that, Native Americans will just look at our way of life, right? Again, culture war. They will look at our way of life and they'll settle down. This word wandering is a word you see again and again and again in European literature to describe Native Americans. The idea you get from European descriptions of Native Americans is that Native Americans are just wandering around kind of aimlessly, that there's no purpose or direction to their life. Now, I will grant the Europeans who have that perspective, right? They don't have the advantage of 400 years of study, and they certainly don't have the example of kind of a bird's eye view of what's going on. We know Native Americans were never wandering around. They lived incredibly purposeful, directed lives. Just like you and I use we put up all kinds of like signs and all over to kind of direct ourselves around. Native Americans could do that with trees. They could everywhere they were just kind of wandering around aimlessly. They knew where they were going. And they could make decisions. We should go here at this time. We should go here at this time. We should go here at this time. Maybe we want to settle down and do some farming here at this time, but we definitely want to get out there and do some hunting at this time over here. Native Americans lived incredibly purposeful, directed lives. Nevertheless, Europeans thought was Native Americans were wandering around aimlessly. And when they talk about making them into men, essentially what Europeans are saying is we're turning into farmers. We're going to get these Native Americans to settle down. Stop their hunting. Stop their mobility. Get them settled down here. Farming. When they settle down and farm like good Europeans, then you think about teaching them, English or French, the right language, and then teach them how to dress, get them out of the business, get them in the proper clothing. Teach the men that they're supposed to be the leaders, not the women, because women are often the leaders and heads of the American. And then we can give the gospel. Then we give Jesus, because we've civilized them. So even the Jesuits, with as much as they try to engage Native Americans, learn the language and what have you, the Jesuits still brought that sense that Christianity and French and namely European culture were like this. They were identical to each other. And so you could not convert a Native American unless you also converted them into a Frenchman or a Spaniard or an Englishman. You had to completely reconstruct their life. It's a culture war going on. And it's the religious figures who were coming in after 1600 and saying, we got to wholesale remake Native Americans. Not just to give them Jesus, we have to completely reorient their way of life. How well did they do? In the 1630s and 1670s, the Jesuits would report about 16,000 baptisms. That's pretty good. A sizable portion of Great Lakes tribes getting baptized. Is it possible to be baptized and like not understand Christianity? Is it possible to submit to baptism maybe for some other reason than that you're trying to show off your identification with Christ's death and resurrection? Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, right. We know that Native Americans, and you'll see that even in the movie that we watched starting next week, Native Americans submitted to baptism for all kinds of reasons. But often what I say, back off or please don't kill us. Particularly as Native Americans began really, the Great Lakes tribes really began being decimated from disease. I mean, we don't know how many Native Americans were killed from European diseases. It can be anywhere from a couple 100,000 to 3 million just in North America. It can be anywhere between 15 million and 100 million if you factor in all the Americas. We don't fully know, but we know that entire tribes were lost, or parts of entire tribes were lost. And when that's happening, plus you're also facing war or threats from your enemies, baptism seems like a pretty good way of saying, yeah. If you guys like kind of take care of us, yeah. Jesus is great. Jesus is great. Give me the damn blanket. Go beat up those guys for me. Yeah, I love Jesus. There's a lot of reasons that Native Americans submitted to baptism during these years, and we'll see some of that in the movie we watch next week. All right, so we can kind of stop right there because we told the history from one direction. Europeans looked to come in and convert Native Americans, and the Jesuits, at least, weren't all that successful. They got some baptisms and stuff, but those baptisms generally did not lead to a wholesale cultural conversion on the part of any Native Americans. So we have stopped there because we told history from one direction. But that's irresponsible. You need to tell history from all the directions for the people who are here. I tell students, I try to teach a geographical version of history. If my job is to teach American history between 1492 and 1877, if that's the goal for this class, then I need to tell the history of everybody who is in this location, right? Not just the Europeans, but the Native Americans. Not just the men, but the women. Not just the slave owners, but the slaves. We need to get everybody's story, at least to some extent. And so we need to look at colonial history, not just from the standpoint of the Europeans, but from the standpoint of the Native Americans. I should mention, if you're wondering about terms, the primary tribes the Jesuits were dealing with in the Great Lakes region were the Hurons and the Algonquins. The Hurons and Algonquins were not a tribe. They were an association of tribes, right? There were tens of thousands of Algonquins. There were tens of thousands of Hurons. And then they had smaller identities. Just like you can be from Jackson and yet be a Michigander and yet be a citizen of the United States. You can have multiple identities. Native Americans had that too, right? So the primary nations that the French were dealing with were the Algonquins and the Hurons. The Iroquois, we'll get to them in just a second. So the primary targets for conversion were Hurons and Algonquins, and it's just not quite working now. But we need to look at history from the other direction. And when we do, we find something surprising. The Culture War actually went both ways. Not only were Europeans trying to convert Native Americans to their way of life, Native Americans were trying to convert Europeans to their way of life. And guess what? The testimony shows that Native Americans were, in fact, more successful. This should not surprise us because, after all, it is Native America that the Europeans are on. It is not Native Americans in Europe. Native Americans had home field advantage. And guess what? In the culture war, in times and places, they are winning. But don't take my word for it. This is what one European had to say. What one French writer complained. Thousands of Europeans are Indians. And we have no examples of even one of these Aborigines from choice being Europeans. Now he's kind of confirming we're not very good at converting Native Americans to the French way of life. That's one side. But the really irksome problem is that Native Americans are turning Frenchmen into Indians. The Indians are going, or the Europeans are going savage. This is the phenomenon of the white Indian. Whenever you see a star next to an item, you want to make sure you're taking particularly good notes on that. You want to make sure that starred items somehow end up in your exams. The white Indian phenomenon is a phenomenon that as Europeans began settling in North America, a lot went native. A lot joined Native American tribes or adopted Native American culture. We can understand the white Indian phenomenon at many different levels. One level, think of those French guys coming to engage in the fur trade. They're trying to make an end to a supply of furs. They're also trying to look for protection. A great way to do that would be to fall in with a Native American tribe, wouldn't it? And a great way to fall in with a Native American tribe would be to learn the language, start dressing like Native Americans, because, you know, after all, Native American dress is kind of according to the climate. So in January, you probably want to dress like a Native American, because Native Americans knew how to dress for January in Native America. Not pleasant thing. But you might also intermarry as well too. Because if you happen to be able to marry the chief's daughter, that's really nice protection for you. There's probably some really nice furs coming your way as well too. So we can understand we can understand the white Indian phenomenon, in other words. Is that clock accurate? 1:20. All right. So okay, good. My phone is apparently done. We can understand the white Indian phenomenon apart from this kind of sociology, economic self-interest. We can understand why the French, in particular, would adapt Native American styles, or even kind of join Native American tribes. What about the stories of the Frances Slocums? This is the story of Frances Slocum. When she was 6, she was stolen by a Native American tribe. She lived 60 years among a Native American tribe. And she was eventually found by other Europeans. She wouldn't leave that tribe. She was a white Indian, this Frances Slocum. Somebody who from childhood grew up in a Native American tribe. But again, we might be able to understand that. What does a 6-year-old know about European cultural superiority? Of course, a 6-year-old at age 60 is going to want to stay with Native Americans. That's the only thing we know, right? So we kind of understand it that way. What maybe a little bit harder to understand is why in the heck would a European tribe take a European in like this? Why would they take a kid, a foreign kid, and adopt him as one of their own? And that is the key word, adoption. Oh, I think I have those in there because I thought I had lost my notes. I moved my office a couple of years ago. I thought I lost my notes. I recovered my notes. I have my wonderful notes now, which I mainly need for quotations, but I built some of those quotations into the PowerPoint slides. We're going to talk about the Native American process of adoption. We'll get there. We're going to use the story of the Iroquois who practiced this technique a lot. Do understand all Native American tribes had rituals of adoption. They had adoption.
adoption is kind of like the way you and I understand it, but more than that as well too. Right? We understand adoption as somebody who's not a part of a family or not a part of your family is legally made a part of your family. Or you adopt a kid, they become a part of your family. That Native American adoption meant that somebody who was not a part of your family is made a part of your family. But adoption for Native Americans meant more than that too. Have you heard the term naturalization? This is much more of a kind of a legal concept. How does a foreigner become a citizen of the United States? Well, they have to undergo a naturalization process. That's kind of adoption is more than just, well, you weren't a part of this family, now you're a part of this family. Adoption was, you are a naturalized member of this particular tribe. You might have been born French, you're a naturalized Algonquin. You're a part of this tribe, you're a part of this family, this extended family. All Native American tribes had adoptions, had adoption process. They had a way of taking foreigners and making them part of the tribes. We're going to look at the Iroquois side just because, probably because we know a lot about it, and just because the Iroquois practiced this a lot. So the Iroquois have and enjoy the designation of being the first United States of North America. We didn't do it first. Iroquois did it first. What is the United States? Is it one thing? Yeah. Is it 50 things? Yeah. It's both of those things at the same time, right? What is the Iroquois Confederacy? Same thing. It's one thing, but it's also 5 things at the same time. Actually, today it's 6. The only tribe I'm asking, the only nation I'm asking you to remember is the Mohawk. They were the founding nation. It's not right to call a Mohawk a tribe. They're much more of a nation or a collection of tribes. What we know is the Great Lakes region was characterized by nearly constant warfare between tribes, between nations. Starting somewhere in the 1300s, a group of nations, a small group of nations, decided to kind of figure out how to get along. So they started in the 1300s, came together and developed common rituals and structure for getting along with each other in the 1400s. By the time the French start popping up in North America in the 1530s, the Iroquois Confederacy has been built. The Iroquois Confederacy is one thing, it's the Iroquois, but it's 5 things as well too. It's the Mohawk plus these other tribes as well. Today, 6 tribes. Eventually adopt another tribe. Now, why did the Iroquois ultimately decide to do this? We know why, right? If you are 5 smaller tribes and you got this enemy, the Hurons, there's a lot of Hurons, and he's like, you're really small. You're gonna say, hey, wouldn't it be better if like we all got together and then like we had a lot of numbers enough to tell the Hurons to leave us alone? I think in the early 1600s, we estimate that there were probably among the 5 tribes of the Iroquois, we estimate there's probably 10, 11,000 Iroquois. Wouldn't it be better if we kind of, did this whole strength in numbers thing? Wouldn't that be better than kind of killing and eating each other? Wouldn't it be better to resist our real enemies, which are the Huron and Algonquin? So these 5 tribes figured out how to get along with each other. They built the symbol of Iroquois unity was the longhouse. Student asked me once, do they live in these longhouses? I didn't know that. I kind of laughed, like, wow, this is a pretty big tribe. They did. They built these longhouses. They lived in them. They also served like ceremonial purposes when the other members of other nations were coming together. This was kind of like their Congress, or just like our Congress is a meeting place of like 50 different states. Right, the longhouses could be meeting places for the 5 different nations to come together and work through their common problems.
So were one of the biggest enemies of the Iroquois the ones right in the middle?
No, we're getting there. We're getting there.
I heard you the Sioux Nation under like their enemies?
Their enemies were the Huron and Algonquin from the previous slide. Those are kind of the, together, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Hurons, the Algonquins, those are kind of the three kind of major Native American tribes that in the Great Lakes region during this time of colonization. So they built these longhouses to try to communicate, both to live together for ceremonial purposes, but also to try to communicate. We are one completed cabin, to use that word. We are a union, we are a unity of humanity. We realize that it's better to get along with each other than it is to kill and eat each other. Why did the Iroquois do this? I've already suggested kind of military, tactical, sociological reason, all strength and numbers kind of thing. If you ask an Iroquois today, why did you guys do this? If you asked Hiawatha, you were Hiawatha from high school? Yes, Hiawatha from high school. Why'd you go and build this confederacy? Hiawatha would have said, well, Daganoweda told me to. Daganoweda, yeah, I'm sure Coach talked to you about Daganoweda. I'm sure we should talk to you about Daganoweda. Who's Daganoweda? Daganoweda is the father of the Iroquois Confederacy. Daganoweda is a prophet who appeared in the 1300s, went to Hiawatha and the Mohawk and said, guys, this is kind of messed up. Gives Hiawatha the great law of peace. What is the great law of peace? Stop killing each other. Stop eating each other. Recognize you're all part of one family. This is Daganoweda's message. It's the great law of peace. Figure out how to get along. Stop killing and eating each other. And the story goes that Hiawatha delivered the great law of peace to the 4 other tribes that became the Iroquois Confederacy. But then the Iroquois Confederacy then had a mission to go out and to further the great law of peace to other tribes and to other nations. The cabin was intended by Daganoweda to get bigger. Here's the interesting thing about Daganoweda. We don't know this guy ever existed. The first account we have of Daganoweda is from like 1743, a Jesuit priest who somebody told him the story of Daganoweda. He wrote it down, and that's the first mention we have of Daganoweda. So was there an actual prophet Daganoweda who gave a great law of peace to Hiawatha? Or is this something that these tribes just figured out how to do, and they eventually kind of invented an origin story to kind of give it more weight? We'll never know. But this is the story that the Iroquois tell. Daganoweda came with a message. The message is to spread the great law of peace. So maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, these Iroquois, you guys seem pretty cool. Right? They're the hippies of the colonial period, running around their tie-dye and their peace signs, trying to, why can't we all just get along, right? Everyone loved the Iroquois, right? No, everyone hated the Iroquois. They're the worst. You guys were awful. They were the worst of the worst. Everybody hated the Iroquois. They're terrible. You say, how could that be? How could it be that the people who were given Daganoweda's mission of peace were actually some of the most violent, bloodthirsty tribes out there? This is the Iroquois. Everybody hated the Iroquois because they were just awful to people. You'll see that too in the movie that we'll be watching. It was a great contradiction among the Iroquois that they often look to spread peace by way of war. So the Iroquois might have targeted a particular tribe that they wanted to go out and make peace with. So, a couple representatives went out, and so did the warriors too. And the warriors were kind of hiding in the bushes while the representatives go up. Hi, would you guys like to join the Iroquois Confederacy? No? None of you guys. Iroquois destroyed you. That's how the Iroquois rolled. It was a really interesting way of building peace. It was how they did it. They often used war as a means to try to build their great cabin, to spread Daganowita's great law of peace. The Iroquois engaged in adoption like other tribes engaged in adoption. Sometimes this adoption took the form of political agreements. Short list here. Mohawks were always trying to make peace with fellow tribes, even if by war. When the Europeans started showing up, that's what the Iroquois did. They tried to make peace in their way. They tried to adopt even the people. This shouldn't surprise us, right? It's easy to come away when we only tell history from one direction. It's easy to come away and reinforce stereotypes of Native Americans as a people without a culture. In fact, Native Americans, like all people on this planet, have a rich, complex culture filled with all kinds of contradictions and all kinds of things to emulate and all kinds of things to hate. And that's certainly the case with the Iroquois. But it shouldn't surprise us when these French strangers started appearing. I should say the other thing too. The other thing that really that Native Americans really hated about Europeans, really kind of freaked them out, is facial hair. Like it wasn't just simply that Native American that European men were pale, but they were really furry too. Like that just thought. Like that was not a normal thing. Like obviously you're a demon because you got a beard. So when these furry Frenchmen started appearing up, it shouldn't surprise us that Native American that Iroquois were like, let's use the tools in our cultural toolkit to try to get along with them. 1622, the Mohawks approached the French leadership in Quebec, and they tried to make peace. They're trying to make peace on a corporate scale now. Our tribes, your big tribe, France, let's try to get along. It only lasts a few years. 1635, the Mohawks tried to make a peace with the Hurons, try to build that log cabin. It only lasts a few years. 1645, the Mohawks again tried to make peace with the French. In this particular case, they are willing to call their land our country, meaning the Iroquois were willing to say the French have these pale furry faced guys. They have a right to this land too. They are a part of Iroquois, right? They weren't going to call it New France like the French were. They were going to say this is Iroquois, like we were here first, guys. But we're willing to share it with you. If you get along, we're willing to share this land with you. Let's all be a part of Iroquois. Peace is broken a year later. 1653, Mohawks again try to make peace with the French. In this particular occasion, the Mohawks tried to adopt the entire French nation into the Iroquois Confederacy, to try to make a sixth confederacy, if you will, now composed of the Frenchmen. It doesn't work. All these kind of corporate level efforts of the Iroquois to try to make peace with the French, it doesn't work. And it's nobody one to blame. Sometimes it's the French breaking it, sometimes it's the Iroquois breaking it. It's all over the place, but it just doesn't work at the corporate. But at an interpersonal level, the Iroquois were incredibly successful. At the level of Ella, taking out of the French tribe and being brought into the Iroquois tribe, that worked really well. The Iroquois were really good at turning Europeans into Native Americans, into Iroquois. But again, don't take my word for it.
The testimonies of some Jesuit priests, as much as around the 1650s or so, as much as 2/3 of Iroquois villages were foreign-born persons. Members of other tribes, Huron, Algonquin, but French men as well too. We're all part of these Iroquois tribes now. Another priest. There are more strangers among them than pure Iroquois. As time went on in the 1600s, the Iroquois seemed to get better and better at adopting foreigners, even Europeans, into their tribe. Now we can kind of understand there's some easy explanations for why that was. Iroquois numbers increasing in the 1600s under a lot of pressures. They're under the pressures of disease and under the pressures of warfare with other tribes. Iroquois numbers are dwindling. They were always a fairly small confederacy. Their numbers are dwindling. How do you replenish those numbers? You adopt. You adopt. You welcome people into the family. And that's what the Iroquois did. Increasingly, you did more and more of it. How is it that a Francis Slocum or whoever could end up a European adopted into one of these tribes? Again, we can understand if Native Americans are going out and raiding French villages, and yes, they're killing some, they're torturing some, as we'll see, but they're also taking some captive. They're not killing some, particularly kids and women. And increasingly, as the 1600s go on, the Iroquois are killing less of the kids and women. Why? Because they are going to become Iroquois. We kind of understand, right? It makes a lot of sense. A 6-year-old, what do they know about being French? So it's easy to bring a 6-year-old into a tribe. You can easily understand how that kid, having been born into a French family, would somehow end up identifying with and becoming raised as part of the Iroquois. What's remarkable about this somewhat is maybe not so much the extent to which Europeans were so, in often cases, easily adopted into Native American tribes, right? Again, if you're kind of keeping track of the culture war, if you look at it in a personal level, again, Native American tribes, Iroquois particularly, were so much better at converting Europeans than the Europeans were converting Native Americans. And we can understand this from psychology, from socialization, how that is. But the remarkable thing is, given the strong sense of cultural superiority and how that led to a distancing of Europeans keeping Native Americans in many ways at an arm's length, why were Native Americans so welcoming? Why did they do this? Why would they take, how could they just take like a stranger, like a child of an enemy or the wife of an enemy, and it's going to bring them in and say, you're part of the family. Now, occasionally you had to go through some pretty violent rituals. Occasionally, when you were brought back, after being made a prisoner of war. I mean, that's not too pleasant, really, being made a prisoner of war. And maybe you undergo some ritual torture. But if you happen to survive that, it wouldn't be unusual for you to be presented to a family. Members of the tribe come and greet you. You're a member of that family. Now, allowing folks to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. Really, really long time. It's really, really hard. It's like, I think it's even over. You know, and how easy it was for Native Americans to adopt Europeans into their tribes. In most cases, it was extremely easy. And here's the thing. It shouldn't surprise us that the Europeans wanted to stay with the Native Americans for so long. How is it that the Native Americans accepted the Europeans as one of them for so long? It's enduring on both sides. Let me tell you the story of Great White Chief.
This comes from 1836, and they wrote down Great White Chief's story. That's how it begins. I was made a chief at an early age, and my sons grew up to manhood. They were also made chiefs. All right, come on. It's one thing to imagine a European being adopted into the Native American tribes with, resupply numbers and what have you. In this particular tribe, European men are being rose up, they're being made chiefs. Tell me the story of the Native American governor of Quebec. Tell me the story of the Native American who became a mayor back in France. You can't do that because it didn't happen, because Europeans didn't accept like that. The Americans did. I was made a chief at an early age, and as my sons grew to manhood, they were also made chiefs. If my youngest son was made chief, I could see a thought that some of the Indians were jealous of the distinction I enjoyed, and it gave me uneasiness. See, Edwards, they weren't quite as accepting as you said they were. This was the first time I ever entertained the thought of leaving my Indian friends. I felt sure that it was displeasing to the Indians to have 3 of my sons, as well as myself, promoted to the office of chief. My wife was well pleased to leave with me, and my son said, Father, we will go with you wherever you will lead us. I then broke the story to some of my Indian relatives. By the way, this is an old white chief in the Mohawk tribe. I broke the story to my Indian relatives, who were very much disturbed by my decision. They immediately called the chiefs and warriors together and laid the plan before them. They gravely deliberated upon the subject for some hours, and a large majority decided they would not consent to our leaving. They said, we cannot give up our son and brother, meaning myself, nor our nephews, meaning my children. They have lived on our game and grown strong and powerful among us. They are good and true men. We cannot do without them. We cannot give them to the pale faces. We shall grow weak if they leave us. We will give them the best we have left. Let them choose where they will live. No one shall disturb them. We need their wisdom and their strength to help us. If they are in high places, let them be there. We know they will honor us. To the extent that North America experienced a culture war on the so-called middle ground in the Great Lakes region, the extent that a culture war took place between the French and between Native American tribes in this region, if we're keeping score, the evidence all points one way. Native Americans were better at converting Europeans to their way of life than Europeans were at converting Native Americans to their way of life. This doesn't just have to do with the sociology of a captive being raised in a Native American tribe. It also has to do with the culture of Native Americans and the radical nature of their acceptance of foreigners. This is why, as we'll see next Tuesday when we finish this story, the numbers of Englishmen who experience this kind of adoption would say, man, these Native Americans, they're more Christian than the Europeans. Shouldn't being a Christian make you like kind of accepting, like we're all like kind of part of God's family, and we should all like have a kind of basic respect for each other? Europeans don't practice that. Native Americans did. To the extent that not only did they adopt foreigners into their tribes, they allowed them to rise up and become leaders. Just very quickly.
Yes, I keep thinking that this class is done at 1:45. It's 1:55, right? So I got a little bit more time. Just very quickly. Look, the middle ground between the French and Native Americans, it doesn't hold. For them, it pretty much after 1660, it's pretty much over. You get a very different sentiment being expressed by the Jesuits. Before the Jesuits, like, we got to figure out how to, how to make the men. Maybe we can establish some villages and stuff. The French never came in those numbers, so that mission never really worked. The conversion work doesn't really happen. What are the French missionaries saying after 1660? Here's one priest. These barbarians must be exterminated if possible, or all the Christians and Christianity itself in Canada will perish. Forget the missionary impulse anymore. This Jesuit priest is saying, look, it's time to exterminate Native Americans.
right, I don't want to say, like, we have genocide narratives of early American history for a reason. Because there are times and places in which Europeans will say, yeah, let's kill them all. We need to exterminate. This is a Jesuit priest. Say, let's exterminate all the Native Americans. Otherwise, they threaten our French civilization. The king listened. The French governor of Quebec agreed in 1664. He sent a 1,200-person army into North America to carry war even to their firesides in order to exterminate them. So there is something to, but when you have Europeans saying we got to exterminate Native Americans, there is something to a genocide narrative, right? When Europeans are outright saying kill them all, it's kind of hard for us as students of history to come and say, yeah, no, Europeans were a lot more accepting of Native Americans. In times and places, Europeans are saying, no, we got to kill them all. We got to wipe them out. The dwindling power and the dwindling power and numbers of the Iroquois would force them into a very different kind of peace. The French and the Iroquois would engage in a very long peace between 1680 all the way into the 1750s. But it was much more on French growth. It was much more the Iroquois having to adopt maybe not French ways of life, but have to submit to French baptism, to Catholic baptism, and swear allegiance to the French king. So it was much more of a subordinate position after 1660, which the Iroquois enjoyed. But if we just kind of start the story there, we really miss the richness and complexity of colonial American history. In times and places, Europeans and Native Americans, they met each other on a middle ground. They could not physically dominate each other. And so they were forced to compete culturally. So they competed culturally. On one hand, to the European attempts at conversion, Native American attempts at adoption. If we are keeping score, the evidence is clear. Native Americans were better at adoption than the French were at conversion. You guys have a nice weekend. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, like, it's pretty early in the